Next, we are moving on to the challenge talks from the winners of the MABe challenge, as I talked about earlier. So our first speaker is Wilde. He is a PhD student with a biorobotics lab at Berlin. He is interested in machine learning and collective behavior. Ben, do you want to get started?
Yeah, sure. First of all, can you see my slide and do they change now?
Oh, it did change. Thank you.
Cool. So yeah, hi everyone. First of all, thanks for having me and for organizing this challenge and this workshop as well. Yeah, today I'm going to talk a bit about my solution for tasks 1 and 2 of the MABe challenge. And I thought before getting started, I would tell you just a bit about my background, what I've been up to the past years, and how I became interested in this challenge in the first place. So I'm a PhD student in Berlin, and over the past couple of years, I've been busy building a tracking system for honeybees. So what we've done here is we essentially film a colony of honeybees, and let me actually activate the pointer here. Oh, sorry. Oh well. So what we do here is we film a honeybee colony for a long period of time, so a couple of weeks, 2 months, and on each individual we have a little binary marker here that encodes a unique ID for each individual. And what we do then is we have a couple of machine learning systems to detect and track individuals, and lastly to detect interactions. In this case, this could be pairwise interactions between 2 individuals. So, for example, trophallaxis, which is food exchange in honeybees, or there's a special case in honeybees where you have a one-to-many communication, the honeybee vagal lens. So you can also have interaction behaviors between one and many different individuals. And so over the past couple of years, we've built a system and accumulated a huge data set of honeybee interactions. And at the end of the first talk today, we kind of had this question, like, what would you do if you had a huge data set with interactions, and how would you actually try to extract meaning from this data? And the people on the panel were kind of the opinion that this is kind of hard, and like right now my PhD is wrapping up, and I have to agree. So actually understanding this data is super hard, and the way I see it, there's essentially 2 ways you can go about this. So there's the top-down approach, which we've been doing for the past years, which is where we essentially take the social networks, so we extract interactions and we build the network, who is interacting with whom at what time, and then we kind of use machine learning to extract descriptors of individuals in this network, and try to kind of learn what the social role of an individual is at one specific point in time, and how it changes over time. But then again, you can also look at this from the bottom up, where you look at individuals at a specific time and try to understand their behavior at this point in time, and then kind of try to build up your understanding of the system from the bottom up. And we have many speakers today which were kind of which are working in this field. Of course, there's like sub-problems here, like tracking and so on. And unfortunately for me, I'd love to do this kind of work on our data as well, but my PhD is wrapping up, and there's just not enough time left for this, because as many of you probably do know, there's a lot of work in actually acquiring not only the raw data, but also to get labels and to get good labels. And for this reason, I became intrigued by this challenge, because this is kind of a similar problem. And in this case, we do have, or you have acquired large amounts of high quality labels and label data. And so I was intrigued to try some of the ideas I did have on this data to see how well they would work. And it turns out in the end they did work quite nice. So my model came out on the first place on task 1 and 2 of the MABe challenge. Just as a quick reminder, task 1 was a more or less standard behavior classification setting where you have labeled frames, and for one of the two individual mice, you have a behavior label. And then for task 2, you have this style transfer setting where you have data annotated by different people, and you try to learn to learn kind of their personal specific annotation style, and to be able to transfer labels from one person to another. So when I started working on this challenge, I was intrigued, but also kind of worried, because it happens that, at least in my opinion, or what I've heard from other people, that in those kinds of machine learning challenges, what you do is not really so much researchy, but you end up doing lots of Kaggle-like tricks. So you do like model stacking and techniques like these, which do work, but they are not super interesting, at least in my opinion. And also, they are usually techniques that you would never use in the real world. Like, you wouldn't like stack 200 models to get like a 1% increase in accuracy. So when I started working on this, my idea was to kind of try to use a principled approach. I had a couple of ideas that I thought that might work, and that were kind of, in my opinion, reasonable. And luckily for me, they turned out to work quite well in this setting. So I was very, very happy not to not to have to use these kinds of Kaggle techniques. I did use an ensemble in the end, but that's the only Kaggle kind of technique I was using. So in my opinion, like, one of the most straightforward or most rewarding ways to improve a machine learning system is to use domain knowledge in your system. And of course, there are different ways to include domain knowledge in your system. And in my solution, I've used 2 of those approaches. And also, I quickly wanted to mention that in my solution, there are many, many small technical details, which are probably not super interesting to talk about. So for this talk, I kind of focus on the 3 points, which I believe are the most important ones, because they are maybe not extremely straightforward, and these are also the things that I believe help most in improving the model. So in terms of including domain knowledge into the machine learning system, I started to build a feature preprocessing pipeline. And the idea here is that, of course, you could just simply take the raw data, which are absolute positions, put them in some kind of black box, and let the model learn the behavior labels. But this would probably lead to a lot of overfitting, and we can reduce this by including some hardwired assumptions in the model. In this case, what I included is egocentric representations, which means that all tracking points are relative to the focal animal. So tracking points, orientation, velocities are encoded relative to the focal individual. And because of this, I didn't need to use, for example, train time data augmentation. So you could, for example, imagine if you took the raw data and you had absolute positions, then you would also include like random rotations in the data to kind of encode your prior knowledge that it doesn't really matter where in the area the individual is. And using a representation like this means that you don't have to do this, which is likely a bit more data efficient. During data analysis, I did notice that absolute spatial and temporal information does matter to some extent. So for example, I saw that certain behaviors are more likely in the edge and the border areas of the arena, and also some behaviors are more likely during the beginning of and the end of the recording. So I did include this kind of absolute information as well, but only in the final stages of the model, with the idea to kind of prevent the model to overfit too strongly to this kind of signal. And because we are running a bit out of time, I'm not going to talk too much about this last point. The idea here was to construct a graph of Euclidean distances between all tracking points of the 2 mice and extract a graph embedding of this. And I used a very simple graph embedding, which is just a PCA of the condensed distance matrix. And essentially, this is a representation of how the two individuals are positioned relative to each other without taking absolute positions into account. And those PCA embeddings I included into the model as well. The second way I tried to include prior knowledge into the architecture of the model was by using a semi-supervised learning approach using a specific objective, which is called CPC, or contrastive predictive coding. And again, in terms interest of the time, I'm not going to explain this paper in detail, but the idea here is that if you have a loss term which encourages the model to learn a representation which is predictive of the future, then you will hopefully learn a model. Then this representation will likely also be informative about the current behavior of an individual, right? So what this model does is it takes a time series of movement and learns this context vector CT here, and then you learn a couple of linear projections which transform this vector into the future. And the nice thing about such a loss term is that it's by itself unsupervised. And the MABe challenge, there was a large amount of unlabeled data which we could utilize. And in the first iteration of my model, what I did was to simply train a model using only this unsupervised loss term. And after that, I fitted a linear model to classify behaviors based on those unsupervised representations. And even this simple model, which didn't use any label data in the first stage at all, performed quite well, actually. So it was roughly on the order of the supervised baseline model. And after that, I turned the model into a semi-supervised model where I used some amount of label data and a larger amount of unlabeled data during each batch while training the model. And finally, when speaking about the three things that I believe helped most in improving the performance of the model, I opted to treat all three tasks of the challenge as one joint task by training one model jointly on all the data and all the tasks that were available. And the idea here was that I presumed that the different tasks are kind of related in terms of the kind of representation you would have to learn to be good at them. So for example, in task 3, you had a certain set of behaviors that you were trying to classify. And in task 1, you had another set of behaviors. And it seems likely to me that a representation which is good or which is helpful to classify one set of behaviors would also be a good representation to learn a different set of behaviors. And likely, or likewise for learning the annotation styles from different annotators, probably using all this data in one big model is helpful because they kind of regularize, they are kind of regularizing the whole model. In terms of architecture, so this is, of course, a deep learning approach, like everyone is using nowadays. And in terms of model architecture, there's no big surprises here. So I'm using a convolutional residual network. If you look at the architecture, so this is a very simplified graphic. Basically, you have the raw data, and then we have a stack of 1D residual convolution layers. And then we have another stack of causal 1D convolutions. And on the output of these convolutions, you learn a couple of linear projections. So these are the linear projections that I've talked about in the semi-supervised loss term. So these basically project the representation into the future. And then we apply the contrastive loss term here. And then we have a shared classification head for the different tasks of the different challenges, of the different classification settings for the different tasks. So for example, here we have classifications for the behaviors of task 1 and a different head for the behaviors of task 3 and so on. And lastly, to deal
Hi,
with
Ben. Sorry, I'm giving you a 30-second warning of time.
Oh, all right.
Sorry.
Okay, so I'm almost through. So the last point here is then to encode different annotation styles. I learn an embedding matrix of annotation styles. So this is just a learned matrix where you have a vector for each annotator, which kind of encodes how similar they are in the annotation styles. And there's just, as I said, many more small details here, but since I'm already running out of time, I think I can skip them, but I'd be happy to share more details on request. Yeah, and the last slide would be the performance scores, but I think it's enough to say that the model performed quite well.
Thanks a lot, Ben. I guess in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the pre-recorded talks from the task 3 winners. And then we'll move on to the panel after that. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. This is the team visual analysis of humans from Oppo Research Institute. I'm Chen. Other team members are Chen, Xun Tao, and Yan Dongguo. We are very happy to have this chance sharing our submission to MABe Challenge Tab 3. For Tab 3, we considered it as a set of binary classification problems for each behavior. That means we have one binary classifier for one behavior. The challenges here arise from both the low amount of training data for each behavior and high class imbalance. So in our data preprocessing, we tried to alleviate those problems. We sampled frames from the original data with different strides to get 3 kinds of data. You can see here. The first one here is sampling frames with stride 1. So we can get continuous frames here. The second one is with frame stride 2. And the third one is with stride 4. We keep all of those 3 kinds of data the same input size to our models. And the temporal dimension here was set to 32. Then we did the augmentation by random key points rotations to balance the number of behaviors data and negative data. Our submission was based on graph neural network, the GCN. It has been commonly used for a skeleton-based action recognition on human pose datasets. The algorithm we used in Tab 3 called MSG3D. It is a very effective algorithm that can extract multi-scale spatial and temporal features and long-range dependencies. It is very effective and useful. In MSG3D, we first built a graph. We can look at this picture. There are 2 mice, and we connected the key points for each mouse, then connected their necks to build the final graph here. Actually, there are some other connections we can try, such as we can connect the noses. This graph may be used to recognize the behavior sniff. We can connect the hips. This graph may be used to recognize the behavior mount. It's a pity that we didn't have enough time to try those different graphs, but we think it's a way that can improve the final results. And the basic MSG3D architecture can be found here, this picture. The MSG3D is a stack of multiple spatial temporal graph convolution blocks. The blue rectangles here, and then a global average pooling layer, then a softmax classifier to output the probability of behavior. The basic and most important block is this spatial temporal graph convolution block. This block is composed of two pathways. The right pathway is a stack of TCN and GCN. The TCN is used to extract temporal information, and the GCN is used to extract the spatial information. We can find in this right pathway, the spatial and the temporal features are not extracted at the same time, but in the left pathway, we can find there is a 1x1 convolution block and a MSG 3D block. This MSG 3D block is actually a MSGCN with a sliding temporal window, so it can aggregate the spatial features and temporal features at the same time, then adding the outputs of these two pathways. This is a basic structure. The more details can be found in the original paper. It is a very useful and effective algorithm. We have used it in a real-time industrial project. The table here is a cost average results on TED3 over 7 new behaviors. MSG3D here is a single model, and it was only trained on TED3 label set. We can find the average F1 score here is better than baseline model. And in our final submission, we assembled different MSG3D models, and we got the F1 score 0.419. It's a big improvement. That's all. Thanks. Have a nice day, guys.